Welcome to the University of Pittsburgh's Health and Explainable AI podcast. I'm your host, Jordan Gaspore, a health and science reporter. Join me as we cover advancements being made in health informatics and explainable AI for students, researchers, and healthcare practitioners interested in applications of artificial intelligence and machine learning. This podcast is produced by the University of Pittsburgh's Health and Explainable AI Research Laboratory at the University of Pittsburgh School of Health and Rehabilitation Sciences Department of Health Information Management. Headed by Ahmad Tafti, Pitt's HexAI Lab cultivates extramural collaborations with academic institutions both nationally and internationally through its research, educational contributions, and this podcast series. Hello, and welcome back to Pitt HexAI, a podcast series produced by the University of Pittsburgh's Health and Explainable AI Research Laboratory. I'm Jordan Gaspore, your host, and today we're going to speak with William Hsu, PhD Professor of Radiological Sciences, Bioinformatics, and Bioengineering at the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA. Welcome, Will. To get us started, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what inspired you to get into healthcare?
Well, hello, everyone. Hello, Jordan. Thank you so much for the opportunity to just be here today. One of the things that I really am passionate about is this idea of using radiological data and data that we collect as part of clinical care to really improve decision making. And some of the things that helped me get there is, when I was growing up, and I grew up in I remember the 90s, early 90s, where, I was really excited to get my first CD-ROM drive. We ordered from a mail ordering catalog and it came in a box, and really started tinkering with computers. Always also had an interest in medicine and looking at how we can improve sort of health. And when I went to undergraduate as a biomedical engineering major, I had the opportunity to really fuse those two interests. So I was really interested in using available data and also using, our knowledge of mathematical modeling to start actually simulating, the heart and different parts of the organs. And so that's kind of how I got down the road of really looking at computational analysis as sort of a field. It wasn't until my junior year of undergrad that I started taking a class on medical images. And that's where it kind of opened my eyes to the power of these advanced diagnostic imaging techniques like magnetic resonance imaging and computed tomography. And so through that, I got interested in applying to grad school. And in grad school, I entered a program called Medical Imaging Informatics. And really the scope of that is just understanding how to work with the data that is generated as part of medical imaging. And so how do we manage it? How do we understand what's in these images? Because, before I went into this field, I didn't realize that computers really don't understand images until you teach it, or at least you train it to understand what is in it. And so going through that whole process of really figuring out how to model what is in an image, how do we understand the differences in pixel values, did I realize the power of being able to use these computational techniques to gain a better understanding of patients and health.
Well, I find that really interesting, just going back to what you said about training computers and how to interpret the medical imaging. So I'm curious if you could expound on that a little bit more about how you train a computer to be able to interpret the medical image.
Absolutely. That's a great question. And so when you boil it down, images are essentially like a matrix of numbers, right? So all the pixel values basically represent a number that is an intensity value. And depending on how you generate the image, so for example, when you take an MRI scan, it's a very different physics than if you acquire a CT scan, which is radiation based versus, something that is using a magnet and trying to get a radio frequency type of signal. And so through those different types of imaging techniques, you generate an image. And so the fundamental challenge is that these images, they represent different things. So they're not like you're taking a photograph of the human body as it's kind of, dissected. It really is taking an indirect picture and looking at what looks like differences and of contrast and intensity values to discern, oh, hey, this is the brain, or this is a different type of organ, and these are the structures within the brain. And so medical images have high spatial resolution, so we can really get fine details about the anatomy. There's a lot of now advanced techniques that you can use to get functional information. So for example, calculating blood flow, calculating diffusion, to look at, again, differences in tissue and then being able to distinguish between cancer versus normal tissue. And so these are all things that have developed over the years with these different imaging techniques. And so I think one of the things that is really exciting about how machine learning is leveraging this is that because all of this data is digitized and radiology, it's been sort of at the forefront. So we probably are the first field that really fully digitized back in the late 80s and early 90s. And just a snippet is that UCLA actually was one of the first sites to clinically use PACS. And PACS is this image archive that basically where all the images go. And so we were one of the first. And through that, they developed standards as well as different computational storage methods and ways to transmit the data to actually be able to aggregate all of these images together. And so because of that, that's where we now today have all these images and things to actually train complex models on. And ultimately, the goal is to take those pixel values that you have and actually then learn more meaningful or more interpretable or human kind of interpretable features like what is the brain or what is the gray matter versus white matter, these type of differences. That's something that a computer won't just automatically know just looking at the pixel values.
So, how great a role is AI playing in changing the field? Since it sounds like a lot. I mean, you convinced me too that like, yeah, AI is definitely having a heavy hand in this field.
Absolutely. The thing about at least excites me about this field is that right now we're at a sort of a point in time where we see a lot of really practical examples of where AI, machine learning can really make a difference in practice. And just to give you a few examples, one of the major active areas of AI today in radiology is using AI in breast screening. And so breast screening historically has been an interesting field because we've actually had a form of AI, which at the time was called computer aided diagnosis back in the late 90s. And it was used, but the challenge there was that the technology wasn't good enough. So the performance was not that great. And so there was a lot of what we call false positives or things that the computer picked up that ultimately turned out to be not anything of concern, but it still had to be looked at by the radiologist. And today, with the technology that we have and the development of neural networks and these type of models that can represent very complex and large data sets, we now see performance that are, in a lot of ways exceeding what a human can do. And there's actually been a lot of studies, as you probably know, about how these algorithms are doing better in many cases than a human. And so these results have led to a lot of companies investing a lot of money to kind of commercialize these algorithms. The Food and Drug Administration has stepped up in terms of coming up with policies to clear these algorithms, and they're continuing to kind of meet the demand. And with that, now we have a lot of commercial algorithms that are out there that do a lot of different things, both in triaging breast mammography images, meaning that, trying to do a first pass kind of read of the image and seeing if there's something suspicious. And if so, then really flagging it to the radiologist. We also have algorithms that are running in the background to check x-rays for tube placement or other types of conditions like pneumonia. We have, algorithms that look at head CTs and looking at pleural effusion. And so there's a huge list of different algorithms out there that are now doing very kind of mundane type of tasks to kind of go through these images, identify potential sources of abnormalities, and then raising those to the human reader to kind of finalize or at least confirm.
And what kind of barriers to AI adoption are you seeing in radiology? I mean, everything that you said sounds great. That I would hope that places would be interested in adopting this, but I imagine there's probably a cost element and some other barriers. So,
Yeah, absolutely. And, that's one of the kind of the open areas of where we are actively looking at. So I would say the first kind of challenge is really the idea of understanding whether or not an algorithm would work. And as you know, in terms of the fundamental idea behind even this podcast series about explainability, trust of an algorithm is really essential for clinicians to want to use and actually believe or trust in the prediction that's made by the algorithm. And so some of the things that we would want to know is, for example, it's great that an algorithm and a company has identified that the performance of an algorithm is very high in their development, the training set that they're using to train a model and to evaluate it in their own studies, right? But that may not translate to how it would potentially perform at an institution like UCLA, which may be a bit more diverse in its population. Maybe there is an older population than what the model was trained on. And so these are factors that could influence the performance of the algorithm. And so one of the first barriers is how do we actually do these type of what we call external validations and understand when the algorithm gets things right and we can have confidence in it. And then also, when does the algorithm get it wrong? And it's when it gets it wrong that explainability becomes such a key facet, because that's when we need to kind of debug it, right? So trying to dig into the internals or as much as we can, right? Because a lot of these algorithms are black box and kind of, we can't touch the internals of it. But at least we can understand what are the limitations and how, if we understand the limitations, then how do we mitigate for those? A second thing that I think is also somewhat overlooked is the idea that there is a cost associated with the AI. So let's say you pay a vendor to provide you a license for an AI algorithm, but there is a much more substantial cost in actually implementing the AI in your complex environment. And so speaking here at UCLA, we have had our electronic health record system, the current version of it we've had for over 10 years now. And building a AI system into this existing environment is not a trivial task. And there is a lot of people time that's required to really assess, the risk and security of the algorithm, to making sure that it actually plays well with all of the rest of the devices and systems that need to interact with that system. And then also finally to the users, making sure that the user is trained and understand how to use the algorithm and it matches the current workflow. These are all things that need to be done to effectively use AI. And those are things that are associated with time and monetary cost in terms of labor and resources, get things up and running. So that tends to be also very much underestimated when we think about, implementing AI. And I think the third one is really the idea that we need a better set of guidelines and best practices on how to actually operationalize AI. And I think for a mission critical type of environment like healthcare, we don't have a lot of room for mistakes. So in some ways, there's a lot of different strategies on how we can implement this, but it's not like we have the luxury to just start running an algorithm and then check back in 6 months and hope for the best that it works out. There needs to be continual validation. There needs to be continual tuning to make sure that the AI is not overcalling anything, meaning like, again, raising the number of exams that a radiologist needs to look into when in fact there's nothing wrong, and really trying to just make sure that it doesn't negatively impact the workflow, because radiology is a very high volume type of environment. And so anything that slows a radiologist down just backs up in terms of, causing challenges within the health system, as well as just, causing burnout and other things. So those I would say are some of the major barriers.
And with that, how are you all teaching students to work with AI?
Yeah, great question. One of the hats I wear at UCLA is we have a training program called the Medical Imaging Informatics Training Program. It is actually offered through the Bioengineering department in our School of Engineering. We also have what we call a Medical Informatics program, which is a graduate program in our School of Medicine. So it is a hybrid type of training program where we draw students from both engineering backgrounds and, clinical and biological backgrounds. And together, we kind of take them through a year-long training program looking at courses like basic machine learning, looking at programming so that you have the basic skills to do the work. Also looking at standards and knowledge representation, which is a really key aspect of machine learning, where you need to know how to represent the data. And for me, I teach a class called medical decision making. And it's a interesting class because it's a bit of a hybrid between basic biostats or biostatistics, which I think is really critical to understand study design and understand how to analyze the data properly. And the second half of it is on how do we evaluate machine learning algorithms. And the class itself is not geared to teach machine learning concepts, but it is geared towards teaching how do we take algorithms that maybe we have developed ourselves, or we are taking from someone else or some other, commercial algorithm, and how do we start running tests on it to understand its performance? And how do we then compare the performance of different algorithms? And so concepts like cross-validation, concepts like treating what is the appropriate metric to measure an algorithm based on what it's trying to do. These are concepts that we try to hone and teach in that class. And I think for the students, the hope is that by the time they finish the class, they really have a sense of, as they do any machine learning project, that they know how to not only build the model, but really start measuring, performance of it, and also potentially thinking about how it could be measured in terms of its impact as you try to apply it somewhere. So yeah.
That's fantastic. Thank you for that. So I was going to ask you this question later on in the show, but I think this is a great time to ask this now as it relates to your research. I understand you collaborated on a paper looking at lung nodule malignancy classification that focused on interpretability. So this podcast, we focus on explainable AI, but I understand interpretability is a connected subject. However, to better understand the difference between the two, would you be able to fill me in? And for those listening on the show that may not know what the differences?
Absolutely. So, I'll be honest with you. I think when we wrote this paper, we kind of use that term interchangeably, but there definitely is a clear distinction between the two. So, explainability is the idea of trying to understand based on, let's say, interrogating the model, understanding what are the important features in the model, how do we try to interpret and explain what the model is using to come up with its prediction. And so really trying to get a sense and intuition on how the model is coming up with its end result and output. Interpretability is really the idea that we're structuring the model or building a model in a way that ultimately the internals of it is very clear in how it's processing and operating on the data as inputs to get the output. And so in the paper that you referenced, we're the goal was actually somewhat both. The first one is that what we wanted to do was build a model from the outset that was interpretable, even though it was using these type of, deep learning type of approaches where, a lot of people think of that as a very black box and kind of too complicated to really understand what's going on. But we really wanted to say, can we architect sort of this neural network that would allow us to understand the features that it's learning in language that ultimately a radiologist or someone who is more non-technical but more with clinical expertise can interpret and understand. And so that was our goal. And we did this in lung cancer and specifically in lung nodules because we worked very closely with thoracic radiologists who had an interest in this space. And we built this model using what we call a multitask learning approach, which is basically creating a model that had multiple different kind of tasks or arms. And each arm basically learned a set of features. And there were kind of two parts to this. The first part is to predict the overall goal, which was determine whether or not a nodule that we're feeding the network is malignant or not. So that was kind of our big question that we want to answer. And then each arm is answering a sub question about what are the characteristics of this nodule. And so ultimately, the model itself, again, is a neural network. So it's learning these deep features that are being basically combined through its layers. But we're essentially using each of the tasks, the subtasks, where we're predicting a characteristic of the nodule to help us kind of interpret what are the deep features that are being learned. And so we showed two things. One is that architecting a model this way actually didn't cost us a lot in performance because there is a lot of discussion about whether making and intentionally, getting a model to be interpretable and, either simplifying things or trying to structure a model in a certain way would actually reduce your performance. And we showed that actually that wasn't the case in this context, at least in our model. And then the second one is that we were able to generate labels from the deep features that the model was learning to basically predict, or at least say for that nodule, what are the characteristics like, the margin is, irregular, the size and the sphericity of the nodule. And these are all factors that a radiologist intuitively think about when they look at an image of a nodule and say, yeah, that looks very suspicious to me. And so as we were developing this and testing this out, we got a lot of feedback from our radiologist colleagues and really realized that, the model was able to generate these type of what we call semantic features, these nodule characteristics, as well as to classify the end malignancy and versus benign output pretty well. And I'll just say one last thing, which is these characteristics, because again, one misconception we have about this paper sometimes is that the characteristics are used to then predict the malignancy. And that's actually not the case. What we're trying to do is still use the deep features to predict the malignancy, but really these labels for the nodule characteristics are kind of like our sort of sensor to tell us, yeah, this model interpreted these deep features and it aligns with kind of this understanding that they are, characteristics that relate to a nodule that would likely be malignant. So hopefully that made sense.
Yeah, no, I think it made sense. So, with that, what other methodologies are you seeing with interpretability?
Yeah, it's a very active field, and there's been a lot of work in this space that probably go way beyond what I, even am aware of. But I would just say this, there's a lot of interest right now, particularly in the radiologic fields, where we're kind of gravitating towards these very complex deep neural networks, or now what we call these transformer models. And they are very data hungry, and they are complex and oftentimes very much seen as like a black box. And I think we often overlook some of the more interpretable methods that already exist. So these would be, for example, your logistic regression models, or models that ultimately you can clearly see the variable inputs and how they're weighted. And I think some of the things that I see kind of going on in the field is really figuring out how to decide which model approach is appropriate, because it is really dependent on a bunch of different factors about the types of data that you have available to train a model, the types of questions you want to ask. And so these are things that I think as a field, we should have a bit better sort of understanding of which approach to use, because it's not a one size fits all approach. I would definitely not recommend going into using deep learning just for the sake of it, right? I think there is definitely some things that you want to consider before you go that route. But the other aspect of this is the explainability portion, which I think is also equally very important and interesting area. Certainly, there's a lot of methods that have been coming out in terms of looking at shapely features and doing these post hoc analyses where you're actually perturbing the inputs and outputs of a model. And actually, I would say some of the other work that my lab has done in this space has really been to try to use these type of explainability approaches to take a very complex model, like learning the association between gene expression and imaging features, and actually trying to understand and tease out what are the relationships between the two. So in the radiology area, this type of analysis is called radiogenomics. And the goal here is really to, again, get down to the biology underneath the imaging that we see at a more organ or tissue level. And so one example that we recently published, and again, lung cancer, is looking at a nodule and trying to characterize features. So what I mean by that is like, texture features or shape features that we see from a CT exam and associate it with potentially different gene pathways that could be identified if these patients had sequencing done, maybe from the tumor, the nodule itself. And so we train this model that takes the gene expression data as input, predicts the imaging characteristic as an output, like for example, whether the margin is irregular. And then that model now has learned this kind of nonlinear weighting of these gene expression data to predict this output. And we basically then try using the post hoc analysis, right? So like what sometimes you term as like masking, right? So essentially taking out some of the inputs and seeing how that impacts the output to try to understand what combinations of genes, let's say if we mask certain genes based on pathway information, ultimately affects the prediction of that image feature, to try to then tease out or at least understand what are the associations that the model has learned, and then tie the two imaging and the pathways together. So that's kind of one way we've been trying to use this to dig into the biology underneath just the imaging features that we can calculate.
Yeah, no, it seems like you're very passionate about bioengineering. That really comes through your voice and in your work. So I'm just curious, especially for those like me who had very little knowledge about bioengineering prior to this conversation, but what is so exciting about bioengineering?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the reasons why I really pursued bioengineering is this idea that engineers really are very hands-on and practical in terms of solving problems. And in terms of medical imaging, one of the things that historically has been a challenge is that radiology has always been seen as sort of somewhat isolated from other aspects of medicine in the sense that people do use radiology to, again, look at the images and maybe provide some diagnosis, but ultimately it gets informed by, let's say, a downstream pathologist who's looking at the cells, and also then the primary care physicians making decisions about what to do next. And so these are things that, for radiology to really advance, one of the things that my chairman in radiology here at UCLA really imparted on me is this idea that radiology is in the information business. And so the better quality information that we can generate out of the images and data that we have, the more valuable we will be in terms of how we can help the patient as well as how we're viewed in the health system. And so his goal has always been to try to delve deeper into what are in images and how do we understand better and have more confidence in making decisions from the images themselves. And so to do that, we had to overcome some very significant barriers. One of the barriers was the idea that because these medical images are generated kind of indirectly, right? Like I said earlier, it's not a photograph of the organ. It's really a indirect imaging where we're trying to interpret between shades of gray and these type of limited information that we have, but it's in vivo, right? So it's very minimally invasive. And to do that, we need to first be able to correlate between the images and what we potentially would see in the patient, like, for example, through pathology. And so, one example project I've been involved in is this idea of trying to develop a workflow where we would actually 3D print a mold to actually hold an organ. So, in this particular case, it was a prostate that was resected from a prostate cancer patient. And this mold, this whole goal of this mold is to actually be able to align and spatially align the prostate that came out to prior MRI images that were acquired of the patient. And so to actually generate the mold, we actually did what we call segmentation of the MRI that we got to actually print the mold. And so then the prostate comes out and it fits in this mold. And then the pathologist uses this mold to cut the specimen. Then they'll prepare a slide on it and they'll do a high resolution scan to get really detailed tissue structure. And so what that mold enables us to do now is actually correlate spatially what we see on the MRI to what we see on the pathology side. And that then allows us to draw just direct relationships between areas that we see on the MRI that may be suspicious and to actually then double check the tissue on the pathology to confirm that, yes, indeed, that is clinically significant prostate cancer. And so this was a very big collaboration. This was not just me, it was a collaboration between the prostate radiologists as well as the pathologist, urologist, and a strong bioengineering team to kind of get this whole workflow together. And so at UCLA, we've actually collected about 1,000 of these cases, and that's now the substrate of what we actually use to train our algorithms in terms of detecting prostate cancer in MRI scans. At UCLA, we are physically very close. So the engineering school is a block or two away, essentially from the med school and the hospital. And so getting the expertise together, right? Because as you can imagine, it takes a lot of interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary type of teamwork to get this done, that the expertise is there. And so we've really been really fortunate. I've been benefited a lot from just the colleagues and the camaraderie that we have in terms of, sharing our expertise.
So before we close, we like to ask all of our guests to offer students who are interested in health informatics a research project idea. What's something that you'd love to see students work on?
So I'm going to take this opportunity. I think I did talk a little bit about some of the projects that I have ongoing, but I want to take the opportunity to actually speak to the listeners who are going to be much smarter than me and can address this much better than me. So the first problem is actually based on a quote that another faculty member here at UCLA. His name is Professor Yuta Pearl. He is often seen as one of the sort of the thought leaders and grandfather of Bayesian belief networks and a whole school of thought there, and now causality, which is kind of his current line of research. And his quote in the Book of Why that he wrote was, "Data are profoundly dumb." And I'm taking that sentence a little bit in isolation, but really what he meant is that, data, if you don't include the context, it doesn't capture the nuances of the problem. And so when you try to train a model on it, you will likely get a model that just sees the world in a very biased way. And it doesn't necessarily generalize, or it doesn't necessarily give you meaningful answers. And so one of the things that he's been advocating is really trying to build causal models and models that really incorporate domain knowledge so that you have, number one, better explanations of the models, because now these type of causal models can explain themselves. And number two is that you're not so susceptible to just sort of the confounding variables and things that are rife in the types of messy data that we deal with in these type of medical records. And so my challenge as one problem is this idea of how do you build this type of domain knowledge into these models? I think it requires a different type of model. It requires different techniques and approaches. And that, I think, is a really, really important space to work in to really advance our field. So that's number one. Number two is now envisioning a world where we're actually not that far from, where we now have AI algorithms. They have been shown to do well for very specific tasks, and people are starting to adopt it. How do we make sure that we're ready for these type of algorithms? And what I mean by that is that there's some really good work that came out of actually one of my colleagues, Joanne Elmore. She studied the idea of the impact of radiologist or clinician performance before and after AI. And so she did this in breast cancer. She had a very seminal work where she showed that through a consortium worth of data, after they implemented the AI algorithm, so this was again back in the late 90s, radiologist performance actually decreased. So it actually made the radiologists worse. They didn't really dig into exactly the reasons why, but they showed that that was clearly the trend. And so one of the things that I would challenge the group is we need better best practices on how to, number one, train the end user about what they need to know about algorithms. How do we characterize algorithms and present it to end users? Because just like how we look at nutrition information on a cereal box, or when we look at a manual for our iPhones or other devices, there's specifications about when you can use these things, what is in it, and those are the types of details we need for AI as well. So there's certainly a lot of work in model cards, model facts that are trying to get there, but we have a lot more work to try to make sure that we understand the limitations of these algorithms, how to best implement them so that the end user ultimately, that interaction, the human computer interaction goes seamlessly. And ultimately we avoid things like anchoring biases and confirmation biases where, the algorithm, if we over trust it and we over rely on it, then we put ourselves at a sort of a disadvantage in the sense that we're more likely to make mistakes because we either are too influenced by the algorithm and over trust it when we shouldn't. So those are things that I think needs a lot more further investigation to make AI really effective in practice.
Would you like to leave a takeaway for our listeners, or is there anything you'd like to share about your lab, any upcoming events or papers you're working on?
Yeah, I think it's a very exciting time. So for those listeners who are, thinking about getting into the field, I definitely think that there is a need for bright thinkers who are really passionate about combining, whether it be computer science or engineering or medicine together. And as we've talked about today, like there's a lot of opportunities, especially in the radiological science space, right? The idea of looking at images and understanding them. Some of the projects I would say that we're currently working on that I'd like to highlight is there's one fundamental challenge that we have with these models and why they don't perform as well as they do, or we think they would do, is that the images are acquired in different ways. So for example, when you do a CT scan done here at UCLA could actually look very different than a CT scan that's done in another institution. And the reason is that based on the device manufacturer, based on the radiation dose, based on other types of parameters, the images will come out slightly different. And those differences, as I mentioned before, because a computer and an algorithm only looks at these things as matrices and numbers, there will be difference in those numbers. So it's hard to tease out what is biological and what is just due to differences in these parameters. And so one of the projects that we're doing that's funded by the National Institute for Biomedical Imaging and Bioengineering is really this idea of, can we use deep learning to even help us harmonize these images, so that what used to be, if we didn't do anything, it would have very different results when we try to quantify the images, that they become much more consistent because we're mitigating some of the effects of these different parameters. And so that's been very exciting work. And the second project I'd like to highlight is more on the translational side, where in breast screening, one of the things that kind of speaks personally on why I've been interested in this is because actually very recently my mom was diagnosed with breast cancer. And so through that process, she had to go through screening. They saw something suspicious. She basically came home and she had to wait for a next appointment to basically, go back and do a diagnostic follow-up, in which case then they determine, oh, we need a biopsy, and then ultimately do some surgical intervention. And this process took, it wasn't that long per se. It was maybe about a month to go through this entire process, but certainly it was anxiety filled. And what helps motivate my work in the space of breast imaging is this idea that maybe we can use AI to help speed up the process, so that women, when they come in for screening, that they actually can be immediately seen by an AI algorithm. That AI algorithm interprets a screener and identifies the ones that are suspicious that require diagnostic follow-up, flags it to the radiologist, who then at that time can read it, so that a follow-up appointment can occur that same day. So there is no delay in getting a result. There is no delay in kind of making a subsequent appointment. And even though it cuts away maybe a few days worth of delay, I think a lot of it is that anxiety and that uncertainty, and being able to provide more definitive information at the point of care at that time. And so I think that's one real area where AI can shine. And it's one area that I'm personally passionate about because of my mom's story. And one that I think, as we're trying to do through this project, is really to now implement a workflow around AI and trying to, again, address all the things about making sure that it integrates well with our environment, being able to make sure that the radiologist and the workflow around this whole process can be accommodated. These are things that we're trying to tackle. So hopefully we'll learn a lot about how to actually operationalize AI through this project.
That was great. And Will, it's been a pleasure speaking with you today. Thanks for joining us. Thanks everyone for tuning in and for following the show. The Health and Explainable AI podcast is produced by the University of Pittsburgh's Health and Explainable AI Research Laboratory at University of Pittsburgh School of Health and Rehabilitation Sciences Department of Health Information Management. I'm Jordan Gospore. Thanks for listening.